Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be exploring a pretty intense book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Now, you've probably heard of it. It's one of those works that really stays with you, and for good reason. It was born out of Frankl's own experiences in Nazi concentration camps. But I think this deep dive is about more than just recounting those horrors.
Absolutely. We're going deeper than that. I mean, this book has touched millions of people, 73 English printings. It's been translated into 19 other languages. It really speaks to something I think we all crave, that need to find meaning, especially when we're going through tough times.
I have to admit, when I first picked this book up, I was kind of steeling myself for, a really heavy read.
Yeah.
But I was surprised by how much life, how much humor even Frankl manages to weave into his account. It really makes you wonder how that's even possible.
That's part of what makes Frankl's work so compelling. He doesn't shy away from the darkness, but he also shows us the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And he does that by taking us through the psychological journey of a concentration camp prisoner. Frankl breaks it down into 3 distinct phases.
Okay, so let's dive into those phases. Imagine you're arriving at Auschwitz, stripped of everything, your possessions, your clothes, even your hair. That initial dehumanization, it's just hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. The disregard for human life was just staggering. And Frankl shares this story that really drives that home. He asks another prisoner about his friend, where he is, and the prisoner just points casually, matter-of-factly, to the smoke coming from the chimney. Like, that's where his friend is now.
God, it's like a defense mechanism almost, right? If you let the full horror of it sink in, you might not survive.
Yeah.
Did Frankl see that kind of detachment in other prisoners too?
Yeah, even in this first phase, the phase of shock, he observed prisoners using different strategies to cope. Some of them developed this sort of detached curiosity about their own fate, almost like they were trying to observe their experience from a distance.
Interesting, like they were trying to make sense of the unmake-sensible.
Exactly. And others clung to any glimmer of hope. There were a few prisoners who seemed well-fed, in relatively good spirits, and Frankl said it was like that gave others a reason to believe that they too could survive.
Grasping at any sign of hope, however faint. But that initial shock, that couldn't last forever, could it?
No, as the reality of camp life set in, the prisoners entered what Frankl called the second phase, apathy. It's important to remember the conditions they were living in, the constant hunger, lack of sleep, the filth, and the threat of death, always looming.
It's almost impossible to fathom. How could anyone survive that for long?
Well, and that's exactly what this apathy was, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming suffering. It was like their emotions just kind of shut down, their focus narrowed to the bare minimum, just trying to survive each day.
So in a way, apathy was a necessary adaptation.
It was a way to cope, but it came at a cost. There was this term used in the camps, the Muslim. It referred to prisoners who had given up hope. They were often emaciated, withdrawn, and tragically, that label often became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those labeled as Muslims were more likely to be selected for the gas chambers.
It's like even the perception of others could have a real impact on your chances of survival.
Right. And even in this phase of apathy, Frankl observed some pretty remarkable things. He and other prisoners found ways to cope, to find moments of humanity even amidst all that suffering. They would invent stories about life after liberation, make jokes about the camp routines.
It's hard to imagine finding humor in a place like that.
Yeah.
But I guess laughter is a powerful antidote to despair.
And it wasn't just humor. Frankl saw prisoners finding solace in intellectual pursuits, debating politics, participating in religious services. He even recounts a story of a spiritualistic seance.
Wow. So even in that environment, they were finding ways to engage their minds, their spirits.
These acts, however small, allowed them to hold on to a sense of self, a sense of meaning, in a place that was designed to strip those very things away.
It's truly remarkable.
Yeah.
But I imagine the longer someone was in the camps, the harder that would become. Did Frankl observe that too?
He did. He called the third phase depersonalization and disillusionment. It's the long-term impact of the camps on a prisoner's very sense of self. Reduced to numbers, seen as objects by the SS. The dehumanization was complete.
Yeah, how did that manifest itself in the daily life of the camp? Were there specific instances that really highlighted this loss of self?
Oh, absolutely. Frankl gives several examples that really stuck with me. He talks about the transport of sick prisoners. The list was more important than the individual. He describes how if someone died before the transport, their body was still thrown onto the cart because the list had to be accurate. That's all that mattered.
God, that's just heartbreaking. To think that a person's life, even in death, held so little value.
Right. And at one point, Frankl actually had an opportunity to escape along with a colleague, but he wrestled with the moral implications of leaving his patients behind.
It must have been an incredibly difficult decision.
It was. But he ultimately decided to stay. And he even found a sense of inner peace in that decision, despite all the uncertainty.
It's incredible to think that even in that situation, he was able to find meaning in his choice.
And ironically, staying might have actually saved his life. He later learned that many of the prisoners who were transported from his camp, thinking they were headed towards freedom, were actually taken to a nearby camp and killed.
Oh, wow. That's a chilling reminder of just how precarious their lives were.
Yeah. And even liberation didn't erase the horrors they endured. Frankl talks about this really disturbing encounter he had after being freed. He reconnected with a friend who revealed that cannibalism had broken out in their old camp.
It's a horrific detail.
Yeah.
But it underscores the depths of their suffering, the degree to which the camps had impacted their humanity.
It's heavy stuff, for sure. And it's important to remember that Frankl, even in describing these darkest moments, he's setting the stage for something profound. He's showing us the depths of human suffering to highlight the incredible resilience of the human spirit.
And that's where things get really interesting. This is where his theory of logotherapy comes in.
You got it. By understanding the horrors Frankl and others endured, we can better appreciate the profound message of hope and meaning he ultimately offers.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. So these experiences, as horrific as they were, led Frankl to a profound realization about human nature. And that became the foundation for his theory of logotherapy. When I first heard about logotherapy, I have to admit, I pictured something very abstract, philosophical.
I could see that.
But it's actually quite practical, isn't it?
It is. And it might surprise you to learn that Frankl believed a lot of our modern-day anxieties, that feeling of being lost or purposeless, actually stems from this lack of meaning. He called it pneusogenic neuroses.
Pneusogenic neuroses.
Yeah, meaning it originates from a spiritual or existential crisis rather than some underlying psychological conflict.
So instead of digging into past traumas or repressed desires like traditional therapy might, logotherapy looks at the present and future. At what gives your life meaning right now?
Exactly. And it emphasizes that meaning can be found even in suffering. It's not about avoiding suffering. If it's avoidable, we should absolutely address it. But if it's unavoidable, then there's an opportunity to find meaning within it.
That's a really interesting concept. It kind of challenges the idea that happiness is the ultimate goal, doesn't it?
It does. It's not about chasing fleeting moments of happiness, but finding a deeper sense of purpose.
So logotherapy suggests that this pursuit of meaning, that's what actually leads to a more profound and lasting sense of fulfillment.
Right. And so you might be wondering, okay, how do you actually put this into practice? Well, Frankl developed several techniques. One that really stands out is called paradoxical intention.
I've heard that. But to be honest, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? About basically willing your fears to happen.
You got it. So Frankl, he describes this case of a physician who had this terrible fear of perspiring.
Oh, I can relate to that.
And the anticipation would trigger excessive sweating, right? So Frankl advised him, he said, try to sweat as much as possible. Lean into the fear.
So he was basically told to do the very thing he was terrified of. Did it work?
It did. By confronting his fear in this way, the physician was able to break free from that cycle of anxiety. Sometimes the best way to overcome a problem isn't to avoid it, but to embrace it.
That's a really powerful concept. It makes you think about all the ways we try to avoid discomfort in our lives. But let's bring this back to Frankl's experiences in the camps. We've talked about the horrors, we've touched on logotherapy. But how did this theory actually play out in the brutal reality of Auschwitz? How could anyone find meaning amidst such suffering?
That question, that is at the heart of Frankl's message. And what's fascinating is that prisoners found meaning in the most unexpected places. One of the most powerful examples is love. Even in a concentration camp, the thought of loved ones sustained them. Frankl himself, he would have these mental conversations with his wife.
It's amazing that even in that environment, love could be such a source of strength. But it also makes you think about the cruelty of being separated from loved ones, knowing they might never see those people again. Did Frankl ever talk about how prisoners dealt with that kind of loss?
He did. And he talked about the importance of accepting the reality of the situation, while still holding on to the love you felt for those you'd lost. It's not about denying the pain, but about finding a way to carry that love with you, even in their absence.
That's a really beautiful way to think about it. So love was one source of meaning, But it wasn't the only thing that gave prisoners hope.
Oh, definitely not. Work, even the backbreaking labor they were forced to do, could be a source of meaning. It gave them a sense of purpose, a way to retain some dignity, and even small moments of beauty in nature. A bird landing on the barbed wire, the sunset over the camp. Those glimpses of beauty, they provided a sense of hope and transcendence.
It's almost like they were clinging to any reminder of the world outside those barbed wire fences, anything to hold on to their humanity. And these small acts of kindness, sharing a scrap of food, offering a word of encouragement, those must have been so crucial.
Absolutely. Frankl tells this really moving story about a dying young woman who found solace in her connection with a chestnut tree outside her hut window. It wasn't much, but in that connection with nature, she found meaning and peace.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It's a reminder that meaning can be found in the most unexpected places, even in the face of death. And it speaks to the importance of choice, doesn't it? Even in a concentration camp, they still had the power to choose how they responded to their circumstances.
You're absolutely right. That's such an important point. Frankl firmly believed that even in a concentration camp, prisoners had the freedom to choose their attitude. And that choice, he argued, was essential to their survival. He even tells a story about how he mentally detached from the suffering of a forced march by imagining himself giving a lecture on the psychology of concentration camps.
Wow, so our minds can create meaning and find a sense of freedom, even when our bodies are in prison.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes Frankl's work so relevant to all of us, even today. It's about recognizing that we all have the power to choose our attitude, to find meaning in our work, our relationships, and even our suffering.
I'm starting to see how these ideas, even though they came from such a dark place, they can be really powerful tools for navigating the challenges we face in our own lives.
Absolutely. It's a message that continues to resonate with people decades after Frankl first shared his story.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. The horrors of the camps, the key principles of logotherapy, and the surprising ways prisoners found meaning amid suffering. What does it all mean? What are the biggest takeaways for our listeners? So we've covered a lot of ground here, the horrors of the camps, the key principles of logotherapy, and those incredible ways prisoners found meaning even in the face of unimaginable suffering. But what does it all mean for us today? How can we take those insights and apply them to our own lives? I'm guessing most of us listening haven't faced anything close to what Frankl endured.
Right. And I think what's really interesting here is that Frankl's work, it's not just some historical account or psychological theory, it's a call to action. He challenges us to stop asking, what is the meaning of life? And start asking, what does life expect from me?
So instead of searching for some grand universal meaning, it's about focusing on what gives our own individual lives meaning. Right here, right now.
Yeah.
Almost like turning the question inward.
Yeah, exactly. It's about taking ownership. And Frankl, he actually provides a framework for finding that individual meaning. He suggests there are three main avenues: creating work, doing a deed, experiencing something or encountering someone, and then the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering.
So it's not just about what happens to us, but how we choose to respond to it. It's that idea of finding meaning even in suffering. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with. It can feel almost impossible, especially if we haven't experienced anything like what Frankl went through.
Right. And Frankl, he makes this really crucial distinction. He's not saying suffering is necessary for meaning. What he's saying is that even when suffering is unavoidable, there's still meaning to be found.
Okay, so it's not about seeking out suffering, but about finding a way to make it meaningful if and when it does come our way. How do we do that?
Well, that's where that will to meaning comes in, the one Frankl talks about. It's what gives us that ability to rise above our circumstances, to find that sense of purpose, even in those darkest moments.
It reminds me of that story about the woman finding solace in the chestnut tree. Even facing death, she still found peace, a sense of connection, in appreciating nature.
Exactly. And that story, I think it highlights another key idea in logotherapy. It's not about finding some cure for suffering, but a cure for the feeling of meaninglessness.
I like that distinction. It suggests that even when we can't control those external circumstances, we can still control our internal response, our attitude towards what we're going through.
Yeah. And that's why Frankl's work, I think, it continues to resonate with people today. It reminds us we have the power to choose our attitude, to find meaning in our work, our relationships, even in the face of suffering.
For me, one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive is how easy it is to get caught up in the day-to-day, to feel like we're just going through the motions. And Frankl's work, it's a powerful reminder that life isn't just about chasing happiness or avoiding pain. It's about living with intention, with purpose.
Beautifully said. And when you think about it, that search for meaning, that desire to live a life that matters, that's ultimately what gives us fulfillment. That's what makes life truly worth living.
This deep dive has been, well, it's been a lot to process. I know I'll be thinking about Frankl's message for a long time, and I hope you will too.
Me too. And I hope everyone listening will as well.
So as we wrap up our exploration of man's search for meaning, I want to leave you with this. Frankl, he challenged us to ask not what is the meaning of life, but what does life expect from me? Everything. How would you answer that question today? Given your own unique circumstances, it's a question worth pondering. And I really encourage you, keep exploring Frankl's work. Discover your own answers. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.